In this problem, they're asking us to issue bonds with a face of or contract amount of $200,000, an issue rate of 103. Term is 20 years, as you'll see later. The periods are 6-month periods, so every year has 2 6-month periods, so 20 times 2 will give you 40 half-year periods. Let's see. The contract rate on the face of the bonds is 9%. Since we're going to be figuring out the interest on these bonds on a 6-month period basis, then 9% becomes 4.5 for 6 months. Now, they're asking us to do a few things here. And I already have done the work, but I want to explain it step by step. Here we'll see how we come up with the bond price. Here we'll come up with the interest for the period, or the 6-month period, as we mentioned before. And then here will be an additional sort of wrinkle to this amount, because we're going to be doing an accrual that covers 2 months out of 6. Eventually, we'll also talk about how do we come up with the overall interest expense based on both the interest from the contract and the amortization of something called a premium. Down here, we'll talk about the journal entries. Now, let's talk about this one first, the initial issue of those bonds. Notice that if you look at the given, that given shows you that the bonds were issued on May. In May. Let me check if that's the case, just to make sure that, yeah, that May 1. And so on May 1, we are issuing bonds with a face of $200,000 as given. The issue rate is 103, which means 103% of the face. So you simply multiply these two numbers to get to the actual issue price. That's how much we get. If you're the issuer, that's how much proceeds we get from the investor. So that's what you see here. Debit cash for the proceeds of 206 right there. We then credit the long-term liability bonds payable for the face amount of $200,000. And the difference between the 206 and the 200 is what we call premium. The premium is a liability account that when paired together with this related bonds payable, that gives you the carrying value of those bonds. So as you might imagine, the carrying value of the bonds at time of issuance, or May 1st, is $206,000. Keep that in mind, because we're going to actually see how that changes as we go down the road here. Let's talk about the second entry here. And notice that with respect to the interest expense, the cash payment itself, and this now is, I think it's November 1st. So I'm going to have to change this because this moves around a little bit. So 5/1, and this would be, I guess, 11/1. That's when you actually make the payment. So the end of the year, the fiscal year for this company is 12/31. So we're not at the end of the year. So there's actually an actual payment happening on 11/1 for the bonds. So if you go back to how we came up with this amount of $9,000, it is simply the 4.5% contract rate for the 6-month period times the face. So remember that it's always contract rate times the face of the bonds to give you the interest expense for those bonds for each period. Again, these are 6-month periods. So the cash payment that we need to provide the investor at the end of the first 6 months would be $9,000. Now, that is not really our interest expense. We're not writing here $9,000 for interest expense, because in reality, the investor gave us more cash to begin with. So even though we're providing the investor with a 4.5% payment, the interest expense to us is actually that minus what he or she already gave us as a premium. So how do we come up with that 150 right there, that reduction? It comes from this calculation here. The face compared to the price, which is again $6,000, is allocated over the 40-year period. I'm sorry, the 40 periods, 20 years, 40 half-year periods. So each half-year period of 6 months, every 6 months, we reduce the premium that they paid at issuance by 150. So if you were to imagine the premium on bonds payable account showing this at issuance, you would see $6,000 like that, and at the end of the first period we would reduce it by 150 with a debit, leaving us with a credit balance of that much. Now I'm just showing you this to show you how the premium is reduced by the amortization. That's the reason we have a 150 debit here to this account. So overall, the interest expense for these bonds that were issued at a premium is not $9,000. The payment is $9,000, okay? But the interest expense is the difference between the $9,000 and the amortization of the premium of $150. So the total interest expense is actually below the contract rate. So the amount for the interest expense for this period is $8,850. Now, if you keep moving forward and you go to the end of the year, you're no longer, I'm sorry, let me just go back. Okay, let me do this again. You are now, and I'm going to do this again here. You know, this was done in 5/1, the issuance. The first payment and amortization of the premium was done on 11/1. And now you're actually here 2 months later, not necessarily at 5/1 of the following year when the next payment comes due. So this is not a payment. This is actually just an accrual to show the full interest expense that belongs to this year. So this is called an accrual. Notice that this is not cash here, but actually instead interest payable. If you go back up, and let me just do that to show you, the 6-month interest, as we determined before, is $9,000 for 6 months. Now here it's only 2 months. Hence why I'm showing you that 2 over 6, 2 months over 6 months is 1/3. So 1/3 of the $9,000 is $3,000. So that's the amount of the eventual cash payment that belongs or that relates to those 2 months. Now we're not paying that yet, so instead we're using interest payable, short-term liability account. The premium is also amortized for those 2 months. We saw before that 150 relates to 6-month amortization of the bond premium, so 1/3 of that would be only 50. So that's when we see a debit of 50 there. And again, the difference between this one and that one gives you the interest expense that belongs to those 2 months, so $2,950. So that's the total interest expense that relates to those last 2 months of the year. And finally, the last journal entry shows you the interest and the payment in general that is due on 5/1 of the following year. Or actually, it's more like 4/30. So this was 5/1. This was 11/1 of the prior year, 12/31, end of year, and now we're back to the very end of that first year. So the second 6-month period is ending here. So the full year now is due. So the second payment is due. As we saw before, the payment for the full 6 months is $9,000. That's the actual cash payment. The interest payable that we booked here already, we already recognized part of the overall expense for those 6 months, right? We did 2 months initially. So that initial or that accrual that happened on 12/31 is now being relieved here. So that's the reason you see this debit to $3,000. So that is now gone. Now this relates to the interest expense and the premium amortization for the 4 months between 12/31 and 4/30. That's the reason you see that this is basically 4 months of interest, and you can go back up and see how you calculate it. And then there will be the remainder of the amortization of the 150 coming through as a debit here. Now that is the journal entry for the second year. And so if you look at how the carrying value of the bonds moves, you can see it here. Issue date, we issued a bond at face 200. Premium was booked for 6,000. Carrying value is 200 plus 6,000, that's 206. Face plus premium. We amortize 150 at the end of the first period. We accrued 50. When we accrued 50, we also amortized $50 for the premium. And then we amortized the other 4 months at the end of the second period, a second 6-month period. So in total, the $6,000 premium came down to $5,007. So now the bonds payable plus the $5,007 balance on the premium on bonds payable account gives you a carrying value for those bonds of $205,700. Notice that as you amortize the premium here, the carrying value will continually drop. And at the very end, after the 40th period, they will drop to exactly the face amount. So the carrying value will be the same as face.